The first time Ethan Callahan saw her again, it was as if time folded in on itself, sharp, sudden, and disorienting. It was a rainy afternoon in Pacific Heights. The kind of day that draped the city of San Francisco in gray velvet and made even the sharpest corners of reality seem like a dream. Ethan was on his way out of a business lunch, briefcase in hand, his expensive trench coat soaked along the shoulders, the weight of million-dollar decisions still heavy on his mind. He was about to step into his waiting black SUV when something on the opposite sidewalk caught his eye. Or rather, someone. She sat on a wet stretch of concrete, huddled beneath a torn jacket, her arms wrapped around two small children, twin girls, no older than 4. Their faces were smeared with dirt, their clothes ill-fitting and soaked from the drizzle. One of the girls clung to her mother's chest, trembling. The other stared blankly ahead, lips trembling from hunger or cold, or both. Ethan could have walked away. Should have. He had appointments to attend, meetings to lead, money to make. But something about the curve of the woman's cheek, the way her hand gently shielded her daughters from the rain, made his chest tighten. He stepped closer, heart pounding. The closer he got, the harder it became to breathe. "Sophie," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. The woman flinched. Slowly, she turned her face upward, and there it was. Through the mud and the exhaustion, past the haunted eyes and hollow cheeks, was a face Ethan once knew better than his own. Sophie Lane. The girl who used to sit 3 rows ahead of him in AP English, the one with fire in her laugh and poetry in her soul. The one who made him believe love didn't have to be cruel. The girl who never really saw him, back when he was the invisible kid with discount sneakers and a backpack stitched together with duct tape. And now, here she was. Broken. Unrecognizable. And yet, undeniably Sophie. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city roared around them, cars honking, heels clicking on pavement, umbrellas brushing past like they were ghosts. But in that fragment of time, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, and the stunned silence between them was louder than any storm. Sophie looked away, tightening her grip on her daughters. "Don't," she whispered. Ethan tried to find the words, but they stuck in his throat. "What happened to you?" She didn't answer. Her face remained a mask, but her eyes brimmed with something ancient and raw, shame, maybe. Or fear. "You shouldn't be here," she said finally. "Not like this." "You shouldn't be either," he replied, more harshly than he intended. "Sophie, these girls, they're yours." She nodded once. The little one on her left started coughing, a dry, pitiful sound that tore straight through him. "Sophie," Ethan said, kneeling despite the puddles soaking through his trousers. "You can't stay out here. Come with me. Please." She laughed, bitter, hollow. "Come with you where? To your penthouse in the sky? You think this is a fairy tale, Ethan? You show up with a shiny car and what, save the poor girl who once didn't know your name?" "I don't care about that," he said. "I care that you're here, like this. And those kids, they don't deserve this." Something flickered in her eyes then. Defiance. Pride. The last remnants of the girl she used to be. "They're the only reason I've survived this long," she said softly. "Don't talk about them like they're a burden." "I'm not. I'm saying they deserve better. You all do." Sophie opened her mouth to argue, but a gust of wind sent the children shivering even harder against her. And Ethan knew he had her, because no mother could look at her children suffering and choose pride over their safety. "My driver is here," he said. "Let me take you somewhere warm. No strings. Just dinner. A bath. A bed for them." Sophie hesitated. Looked at her daughters. Then at him. Then nodded. He offered his hand. She took it, reluctantly, as if it burned to be touched, and together, they walked to his SUV. Ethan lifted one of the twins into his arms, surprised by how light she was. Just skin and bones. Her tiny fingers clutched his collar, and his heart nearly cracked. Inside the vehicle, silence stretched again. Sophie sat like a stranger in someone else's dream, staring out the window, her daughters pressed against her side. "I don't want your pity," she said suddenly. Ethan looked over at her. "It's not pity." "Then what is it?" He didn't answer. Because he wasn't sure. Guilt, maybe. Or unfinished love. Or just the unbearable ache of seeing someone you once admired brought so low. When they reached his penthouse, Sophie's breath caught. The elevator alone was bigger than the shelter she'd stayed in last week. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the curated artwork, the muted elegance, it was another planet. "I don't belong here," she whispered. "Yes, you do." She turned to him. "Why are you doing this, Ethan?" He hesitated. Then spoke the truth. "Because I used to watch you walk through the halls like you were made of light. Because I've thought about you more than I should have. Because seeing you today broke something in me I didn't know was still fragile." Sophie blinked, stunned. Then looked away. The twins fell asleep almost instantly on the oversized couch, curled together like two halves of a whole. Ethan brought her a blanket. She took it without a word. He didn't ask questions that night. Didn't push. He just let her sit in silence, surrounded by warmth and stillness she hadn't known in years. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Sophie finally said, "Their names are Ava and Lily." "They're beautiful," Ethan replied. "They saved me," she added. "Even when I couldn't save myself." And with that, she leaned back, eyes fluttering closed, exhaustion claiming her. Ethan stayed awake, watching her, listening to the gentle breaths of the sleeping girls, and wondering what choices, what betrayals, what tragedies had led Sophie Lane to that street corner. He didn't know it yet, but that night would change everything, not just for Sophie, not just for Ava and Lily, but for Ethan himself. Because compassion may start with a gesture, but love is built moment by moment. And this was only the beginning. Morning arrived like a whisper, soft, tentative, as if even the sun was hesitant to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over Ethan Callahan's penthouse. The early rays filtered through the sheer curtains, casting golden light across the modern, glass and marble space. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel hollow. Sophie Lane stirred on the oversized couch, still wrapped in the wool blanket Ethan had laid over her hours earlier. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she looked around like she didn't recognize where she was. The warmth, the silence, the absence of fear, it all felt too unfamiliar to be real. She sat up slowly, expecting her daughters to be gone, or worse, for it all to have been a cruel dream. But there they were. Ava and Lily lay curled up at the far end of the couch, still asleep, their faces relaxed in a way Sophie hadn't seen in years. No worry etched between their brows. No trembling from cold or hunger. Just peace. She brought a trembling hand to her mouth. Tears threatened to rise, but she forced them back down. Not here. Not yet. In the kitchen, Ethan was already awake, dressed in a navy sweater and jeans, coffee mug in hand. When she walked in, he looked up and smiled, not a rehearsed smile, not the kind men like him wore at board meetings or photo shoots, but something quieter. Warmer. "Morning," he said. "I didn't want to wake you." "You didn't," she replied, her voice rough with sleep. "Thank you. For all of this." "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do." Ethan gestured toward the dining table. Breakfast was laid out, toast, fruit, eggs, oatmeal, even a small carton of chocolate milk. Sophie blinked, momentarily overwhelmed. "They haven't had a meal like this in. I don't even know." "Well," he said gently, "they're going to have one today." Ava and Lily soon joined them, sleepy-eyed but giggling at the sight of chocolate milk and warm pancakes. Sophie watched them eat like it was the first time she'd seen them truly alive. Ethan didn't pry, didn't hover. He simply made sure their plates were full, that the space around them felt safe. When the girls had finished and were playing quietly in the next room, Ethan turned to Sophie. "Can we talk?" Sophie stiffened. "About what?" "About how you got here." She looked away. "I don't want your pity." "It's not pity, Sophie. It's understanding. You were one of the brightest people I knew. I want to know what happened." Sophie exhaled long and slow, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. For a moment, she didn't say anything. But then, as if something cracked open inside her, the words came. "I met someone after high school," she began. "His name was Nathan. He was charismatic. Ambitious. Dangerous in the way people are when you're too young to see through charm." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "We started dating right after I turned 18. Within months, I was pregnant. I was scared, of course. But I thought, stupidly, that love would be enough. That we'd figure it out." She paused, the memory flashing across her face like a storm. "When I told him, he left. No explanation. No goodbye. One day we were dreaming about apartments and baby names, the next he was gone. Blocked my number. Disappeared like I never existed." Ethan looked down, his fists clenched beneath the table. "My parents were furious. Not because I was pregnant, but because I had ruined their image. They told me if I kept the babies, I couldn't stay. So, I left. I worked through the pregnancy, barely made enough for rent. And then when Ava and Lily came, her voice broke. I tried so hard, Ethan. I did everything I could. But raising twins alone, with no money, no support, it chews you up. I lost my job when they got sick and I couldn't make a shift. Then the eviction notice came. And just like that, we were on the streets." Ethan sat in stunned silence, her words like punches to his chest. "How long?" he asked. "Too long," she whispered. "Years. Why didn't you ask for help?" She gave him a sad smile. "I didn't think I was allowed to. Not from you. Not from anyone. Pride is a strange thing. When everything is taken from you, it's the last thing you try to hold on to, even if it's choking you." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low. "Sophie, I had no idea. If I'd seen you, known you needed something, I wouldn't have let you help. I was too proud. Too ashamed." He nodded slowly. "But not anymore." "No. Not anymore." That afternoon, he gave her a tour of the penthouse. The guest suite, with its king-sized bed, private bath, and walk-in closet, felt more like a luxury hotel than a spare room. Sophie touched the soft linen sheets like they were made of glass. "I'll understand if you'd rather leave," Ethan said gently. "But the room is yours. For as long as you need it." I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me help. That you'll let yourself start over." "I want to," she whispered. "I'm just scared I don't know how." "You don't have to do it alone." That night, as Sophie tucked her daughters into a real bed for the first time in years, she watched their small faces relax in sleep. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way back to the life she lost. The next morning, she awoke to sunlight on her face and the smell of fresh coffee. In the kitchen, June, the housekeeper Ethan had introduced briefly the day before, was humming softly while preparing breakfast. "Good morning, Miss Sophie," she said warmly. "I hope you slept well." "I haven't slept that well in years," Sophie replied truthfully. Later, while the twins played in the sunlit living room, Ethan returned home early from a meeting. He carried a few bags and a folder under his arm. "What's all this?" Sophie asked. I thought maybe the girls could use a few more clothes, he said, setting down the shopping bags. And these are for you. He handed her the folder. Inside were pamphlets for community colleges, child development courses, adult education grants, and scholarship applications. Sophie stared at them, stunned. I remember you said you wanted to work with kids someday, he said. Maybe this is the first step. She laughed, but it came out wet with emotion. You remember that? I remember everything. Sophie didn't respond. She couldn't. Instead, she walked over and wrapped her arms around him, just for a second, but long enough for him to feel the weight she'd been carrying for years. And long enough for her to realize she didn't want to carry it alone anymore. As the week went on, Sophie began to open up, first to June, then to Ethan. They spoke at night, after the girls went to bed. About life. About dreams long buried. About healing. Each day brought some small new step, a call to the college admissions office, a short walk to the bookstore, a slow rebuilding of confidence brick by brick. Ethan, too, was changing. The penthouse, once pristine and clinical, now had toys in the corners and crayon drawings on the fridge. His schedule began to bend around story time and bath time. He found himself thinking not just about the next deal, but about what Ava and Lily might want for dinner, or what kind of bedtime story would make them laugh the most. And Sophie began to smile again. Not the tight, practiced smile of someone surviving, but the unguarded, luminous one he remembered from so long ago. One evening, after the twins had fallen asleep with stuffed animals tucked under their arms, Sophie stepped out onto the balcony. Ethan joined her, the city lights stretching before them like constellations. I used to think second chances were for other people, she said. So did I. Do you think we can really start over? Ethan looked at her, his voice steady. I think we already have. And in that moment, standing under the stars with the wind tugging gently at their hair, neither of them felt broken anymore. They just felt, beginning. The transformation didn't arrive with a bang or dramatic flourish. It came quietly, like the slow unfurling of petals after a long winter, tentative, tender, yet undeniably alive. Sophie Lane had never known what it felt like to wake up without dread tightening her chest. But now, in the peaceful mornings of Ethan Callahan's penthouse overlooking San Francisco Bay, she opened her eyes to soft sunlight, the sound of her daughter's laughter, and a strange new feeling she could barely name, peace. It wasn't instant. Healing never is. But it was real. Each morning started with routine, June preparing breakfast, the girls tumbling into the kitchen in oversized pajamas, Ethan emerging from his room with sleeves rolled and eyes still heavy with sleep. Sometimes, he'd join them for toast and coffee before heading to work. Other times, he'd linger, helping Lily tie her shoelaces or listening as Ava explained her dream in great detail. He became a part of their mornings, not as a guest in their lives, but as someone slowly becoming family. Sophie often stood back, watching it all, quietly overwhelmed. It felt fragile, like it could slip away the moment she let herself believe in it too deeply. But each time Ethan smiled at her across the table, or gently placed a hand on Ava's back, or asked about her classes without judgment or expectation, she felt that doubt erode, piece by piece. School had become more than just an escape, it was a rediscovery. With Ethan's help, Sophie had enrolled in early childhood development courses at a local community college. She attended classes 3 days a week while June watched the girls. It was humbling to sit in a classroom again after all those years. At first, she felt awkward, older than some students, unsure if she still belonged in a place where people spoke of careers and futures. But she showed up. Every day. And that began to matter more than the self-doubt. Ethan surprised her one afternoon by showing up early outside her campus building, leaning casually against his car with a coffee in hand. "You look like someone who could use a ride," he said with a crooked smile. Sophie couldn't help but laugh. "What are you doing here?" "I had a break between meetings. Figured I'd come steal you away." steal me where? There's a bookstore you need to see. The shop he took her to was tucked into a side street in the Mission District. Old wood floors, shelves that reached the ceiling, the faint scent of paper and dust and time. Sophie's fingers lingered on the spines of books she hadn't thought about in years: children's psychology, developmental theory, teaching methodologies. Ethan watched her with quiet satisfaction, letting her explore, letting her rediscover. On the way home, he asked, "Do you remember who you were before everything went dark?" She turned to him, the question landing like a whisper in her soul. "Not always. But in moments like that. I feel her again." That night, after the girls were asleep and the city lights flickered beneath the stars, Sophie stood by the large window in the living room. Ethan joined her, a glass of wine in hand. "They're happier now," she said, looking out. "They have you. They have you, too," she said softly, not looking at him. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed the glass on the table and stood beside her. "I don't know what this is, Sophie. What we're becoming. But I know I don't want it to end." She turned, surprised by his honesty. "I don't expect anything," he continued. "But if there's room in your life, for more than just rebuilding, I'd like to be in that space." Sophie looked at him, the man who had once been a stranger, who had found her on a street corner and didn't walk away. The man who had fed her children, made them laugh, believed in her when she didn't. Her heart ached with the fear of letting herself feel this, but also the longing to finally stop running. "There might be," she said. "But I'm still finding it." He nodded, no pressure in his eyes. "That's enough for me." Weeks passed, and life began to take on a new rhythm. Sophie's confidence grew with each assignment she completed, each presentation she gave. She started helping June around the house, not out of obligation, but because it felt good to contribute. She even took on planning Ava and Lily's 6th birthday party, something she had once thought impossible. "I want unicorns," Lily announced one morning. "And a cake with sparkles," Ava added. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Sparkles? That's a tall order." "We believe in you," Sophie teased. The party was held in the rooftop garden, strung with fairy lights and pastel balloons. A hired magician made balloon animals, and a local baker delivered a 2-tier cake covered in glittery frosting. Sophie watched her daughters dance, their joy echoing through the air like music. For a moment, she forgot everything that had come before. There was only this, a life reimagined, and the quiet, powerful realization that she had built it herself. Later that evening, as the guests left and the rooftop fell silent, Ethan handed Sophie a small gift. Inside was a leather-bound notebook with her initials embossed in gold. "What's this?" she asked. "Your future," he said. "Plans. Ideas. Dreams. You've earned them." Her hands trembled slightly as she traced the letters. "You keep giving me more than I know what to do with." "No," he said. "I just see what's already there." That night, Sophie lay awake in her bed, the notebook beside her. She opened to the first page and wrote a single line: "This is not the end of my story. This is the beginning." Their connection deepened, though neither of them spoke the word love. It was there, unspoken, in the way Ethan learned to braid Lily's hair on the morning Sophie was running late. In the way Sophie waited by the door every evening when she knew he'd be home. In the way the girls began calling him E, like a nickname only family would use. But love, especially love after pain, required courage. And Sophie was still learning to be brave with her heart. One evening, after dinner, Ethan invited her out for a walk. The air was crisp, the kind of chill that made you lean a little closer. They wandered down to a small park near the pier, where the water shimmered under streetlights. "I didn't think I could ever feel this grounded," Sophie said. "Like I wasn't constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop." "You don't have to wait anymore," he replied. "You're not who you were." "I know," she whispered. "But sometimes I still feel her, the girl who was left behind. Who was forgotten. Ethan gently took her hand. She was never forgotten. She survived. And now she's becoming something even stronger. Sophie blinked back tears. Why do you keep believing in me? Because I see you, he said. All of you. And I know what it means to rise from ashes. You're not a victim of your past, you're proof that healing is possible. That night, back at the penthouse, Sophie curled up on the couch while Ethan read to the twins. They had chosen Charlotte's Web, and his deep voice wove through the room like lullabies. The girls eventually fell asleep on either side of him, their heads resting against his chest. Sophie stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold, the man who had once been a stranger now cradling the two people she loved most in the world. And in that quiet, sacred moment, she felt the final piece of herself click back into place. The woman who had once begged for spare change on the sidewalk was gone. In her place stood a mother, a student, a survivor, and perhaps, just perhaps, a woman ready to love again. And somewhere deep inside her, that future didn't feel so impossible anymore. There's something about peace that feels borrowed when you've lived too long in survival. Sophie had finally reached a fragile sense of normalcy, mornings filled with laughter, evenings spent over puzzles and bedtime stories, a growing sense of confidence as she balanced motherhood, education, and the tender spark of something new with Ethan. But peace, for people like her, always came with the fear that someone, or something, would come to collect. And it did. On an unassuming Saturday morning, that debt came knocking. She was pouring cereal for Ava and Lily when her phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a name she hadn't seen in nearly 6 years. Nathan. The bowl trembled in her hand. Sophie. Ethan's voice came from the hallway, casual, unaware. She gripped the counter. It's nothing, she lied, silencing the phone and forcing herself to breathe. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Later that afternoon, when the girls were napping and the sunlight had shifted to a golden hush in the penthouse, Ethan found her sitting silently at the edge of the bed, the phone still in her hand. You've been quiet, he said gently. What's wrong? She looked up, eyes glassy. He called. Nathan. Ethan didn't need clarification. He sat beside her, his presence a calm anchor. What did he want? He said he's in the city. That he heard I'm doing better, and he thinks it's time he sees his daughters. Ethan's expression remained still, but she could see the flash of something in his eyes, anger, protectiveness, disbelief. And what do you want? She swallowed hard. I don't know. I don't know what's right. He abandoned us, Ethan. He walked away when I was 6 months pregnant and never looked back. And now, suddenly, he wants to reconnect. Do you trust him? No, she whispered. But I also don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering if I denied the girls a chance to know their father. You won't face this alone, Ethan said. Whatever you decide to do, I'm here. The next day, Sophie agreed to meet Nathan. She chose a cafe on a busy street in No Valley, public, visible, neutral. Ethan came with her, not to interfere, but to make sure she felt safe. Nathan arrived late, dressed in a designer jacket and sunglasses, his hair slicked back with the same casual arrogance that once drew Sophie in and later left her crushed. His smile faltered slightly when he saw Ethan beside her. I wasn't expecting a chaperone, he said coolly. Sophie didn't return the smile. You lost the right to expect anything from me. Nathan slid into the seat across from them. I just want to talk. I've made mistakes, okay? I'm not denying that. But I want to know my daughters. You've missed 6 birthdays, Ethan said calmly. You've never sent a letter. Not even a phone call. Nathan looked at Sophie. I wasn't ready. I panicked. I thought I'd ruin their lives. But I've changed. I want to try. Sophie studied him. His words were smooth, too polished. The kind of apology rehearsed more for appearance than truth. But something in her wanted to believe. Wanted to believe people could change the way she had. Trying isn't just showing up once and making promises, she said quietly. If you want to be in their lives, you need to prove it. With time. With consistency. Nathan nodded, too eagerly. Of course. Whatever it takes. But Sophie saw it then, his discomfort, the way he glanced at his watch, the shallowness behind the charm. Something was off. And yet, a small part of her hoped she was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Nathan made attempts. He visited once, bringing teddy bears that still smelled like the department store. He texted sporadically, asking vague questions. But when Ava's school had its open art day, an event Sophie gently invited him to, he didn't show. No excuse. No call. Then he missed Lily's dentist appointment, a moment she had tearfully hoped would be a chance for him to show her he could be present. But again, he vanished. The girls didn't ask much. They hadn't formed a bond, just an image. A fantasy. And that fantasy was unraveling. One evening, after another no-show from Nathan, Sophie stood at the window of the penthouse, watching the girls play below in the courtyard garden. Their giggles floated upward like music. Ethan joined her quietly, handing her a cup of tea. "He's not coming, is he?" she said, not looking away. "No," Ethan said gently. "He's not." She nodded, more weary than surprised. "I wanted to give him a chance. Maybe for the girls. Maybe for me. I thought, if he could prove he was different, it would mean everything we went through wasn't in vain." "You've already proved that, Sophie. You didn't need him to validate your strength." She turned to face him. "You've been more of a father to them in 6 months than he's tried to be in 6 years." Ethan's eyes softened, and for a moment, the silence between them said more than words could. Later that night, after the girls had been tucked into bed and the apartment was wrapped in quiet, Sophie found herself sitting beside Ethan on the rooftop terrace. The lights of the Bay Bridge glowed faintly in the distance. "I keep thinking about forgiveness," she said, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Not for Nathan's sake. But for mine. I don't want to carry him with me anymore, not in anger, not in regret." Ethan reached over, his hand brushing hers. "Forgiveness doesn't mean letting someone back in. Sometimes, it just means releasing their hold on your story." Sophie breathed in deeply, letting the night fill her lungs. "Then I think I'm ready to let go." The next day, she called Nathan one last time. "I don't think you're ready," she said, her voice steady. "And I won't let my daughters be hurt by inconsistency. When they ask about you, I'll tell them the truth. But from now on, this chapter is closed." Nathan didn't argue. Maybe part of him knew it was inevitable. With that call, Sophie felt a weight lift off her chest. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was clarity, the quiet knowledge that she had protected her daughters, and herself, from another storm. That evening, Ava crawled onto her lap while Lily sat beside Ethan on the couch, flipping through a storybook. "Are we a real family now?" Ava asked, resting her head on Sophie's shoulder. Sophie kissed her forehead. "We've always been a real family." And as she glanced across the room at Ethan, his gentle smile, his quiet strength, she knew that what they were building together wasn't temporary. It wasn't charity. It was home. The past had come knocking. And this time, Sophie hadn't just answered the door, she'd faced it, honored it, and then let it go. She wasn't the girl Nathan had left behind. She was a woman standing tall, with daughters laughing at her feet, and a man beside her who chose them every single day. And nothing, no ghost from the past, could take that away. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the gauzy curtains of the penthouse, bathing the room in a golden hue that seemed to echo the quiet transformation of a life once fractured. Sophie stood in front of the mirror, her graduation robe draped over her shoulders, her hands slightly trembling, not from nerves, but disbelief. There had been a time, not long ago, when she thought the only thing her hands would ever hold again was loss. But here she was, standing tall, the air around her charged with a kind of hope she'd forgotten existed. In the next room, Ava and Lily giggled as they practiced handing her a homemade bouquet. The living room had been decorated with hand-painted signs in glitter and crayon, and Ethan was waiting in the car to drive her to the ceremony. Sophie walked out to find the girls ready, both wearing matching blue dresses, their hair in loose curls. When she appeared, they gasped as if seeing a queen. "Mommy, you look like a teacher," Ava declared. "Or a superhero," Lily added proudly. Sophie crouched and pulled them close. "You two are my reason for everything. Don't ever forget that." At the small community auditorium, the atmosphere buzzed with the energy of new beginnings. Ethan sat in the front row, flanked by the twins, who clapped wildly the moment Sophie's name was called. As she walked across the stage, tassel swaying, 1,000 memories swept through her, nights in shelters, hunger she could barely endure, the weight of motherhood carried alone. And now, this. After the ceremony, back at the penthouse, June had prepared a modest celebration. There was cake with too much frosting, music that made the girls dance barefoot in the living room, and laughter that spilled into the walls like a promise. Ethan handed Sophie a small, velvet box. Inside was a delicate gold necklace in the shape of a tree. "For the roots you rebuilt," he said, "and the branches you've yet to grow." Sophie touched the charm, overcome. "I don't know how I got here." Ethan smiled. "You didn't get here. You climbed. And you never stopped." Later that evening, when the girls were asleep and the house had fallen into stillness, Sophie found Ethan on the rooftop terrace, where the city stretched out like a map of everything they'd weathered. She sat beside him, the night air cool but comforting. "I used to come up here when I was lost," she admitted. "Before I had the girls. Before everything. I'd look out and wonder if life would ever start feeling like mine again." Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady. "And now? Now it does. For the first time in a long time." He reached into his coat pocket, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Sophie, I don't want to just be the person who helped you rebuild. I want to be the person who continues building with you. Every day. For the rest of our lives." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, and radiant. Sophie gasped, covering her mouth. "Ethan. I know what you've been through. I've seen how hard you fight, how fiercely you love. And I don't take this lightly. You and the girls, you're my home. So I have to ask. Will you marry me?" For a moment, the world stood still. Then, with tears slipping freely down her cheeks, she whispered, "Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and she threw her arms around him, burying herself in the warmth of a future that had once seemed unimaginable. In the months that followed, plans unfolded like spring blossoms. They chose a quiet botanical garden near the bay for the ceremony, intimate, surrounded by nature, as if the world itself was bearing witness to their second chance. On the morning of the wedding, Sophie sat in a small sunlit room, watching Ava and Lily twirl in their flower crowns. Her dress was simple but graceful, ivory lace flowing like wind over water. June adjusted her veil with a teary smile. "You look like someone who was never broken." "I was," Sophie whispered. "But somehow, I'm still whole." Outside, Ethan waited at the altar. When Sophie stepped into view, the breath caught in his chest. She walked slowly, hand in hand with her daughters. Every step was a triumph. Every gaze from the guests was filled with awe, not just at her beauty, but at the unmistakable presence of healing. Their vows were not elaborate. They spoke of truth, of choosing each other not for perfection, but for perseverance. Ethan promised to love Sophie and the girls with a patience born from gratitude. Sophie promised to trust the love she had once feared would never return. When they kissed, it was not the spark of something new, but the quiet sealing of a bond already forged in fire. After the wedding, life settled into something extraordinary in its simplicity. Ethan adjusted his schedule to spend more time at home. Sophie began working part-time as an assistant at a non-profit daycare, putting her degree to use while still being present for the girls. Every morning began with a shared breakfast. Ava and Lily would take turns telling jokes that made no sense but earned belly laughs anyway. Ethan packed lunches. Sophie practiced mock interviews with her students. Their home, once a symbol of wealth and solitude, now echoed with the sound of real joy. And then, life offered one more surprise. Sophie had been feeling tired for weeks, her energy waning despite rest. One morning, while preparing for work, a wave of dizziness brought her to her knees. Ethan insisted she see the doctor. She resisted, old habits of dismissal and endurance flaring up, but eventually relented. A few days later, the doctor smiled gently across the desk. "Congratulations, Sophie," she said. "You're pregnant." Sophie blinked. What?" A hush fell over her, as if the world itself had stopped moving. "A baby. With Ethan." She left the office in a daze, joy and panic coiling tightly in her chest. At home, she found Ethan building a bookshelf with Lily in the living room, Ava handing him screws with great ceremony. "I need to tell you something," she said. Ethan stood immediately, sensing her seriousness. "I'm pregnant," she said, the words barely above a whisper. For a heartbeat, Ethan didn't react. Then, slowly, his face lit up. He crossed the room in 2 strides and wrapped his arms around her. "This is the greatest news," he said into her hair. "We're going to be a family of 5. The months that followed were filled with preparation, nursery colors debated, names tried and tossed, twin sisters practicing lullabies for their future sibling. Ethan was more attentive than ever, researching prenatal health, insisting Sophie rest, and involving the girls in every step of the journey. One quiet evening, after reading bedtime stories and tucking in the twins, Sophie stood in the nursery, her hand resting over her belly. Ethan joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "This baby will never know what it's like to be unwanted," she said. "They'll know love from the second they open their eyes," he promised. In the early spring, as cherry blossoms returned to San Francisco, Sophie went into labor. It was swift, intense, but she was surrounded, by a partner who never left her side, by daughters who waited eagerly, and by the strength she had spent years unknowingly cultivating. They welcomed a son. Healthy. Perfect. His cry filled the room like a hymn of resilience. Ethan held him, awestruck. Sophie wept softly. "Hello, baby," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." When they returned home, Ava and Lily each took a turn holding their brother, eyes wide with wonder. "What's his name, Mommy?" Lily asked. Sophie looked at Ethan. They had discussed names for months but never truly decided. "Let's call him Hope," Ethan said suddenly. "Because that's what he is. That's what you all are." They agreed. From that day forward, the family moved as one. Together for park picnics and sleepless nights, first words and scraped knees, quiet tears and overwhelming joy. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and full, and fiercely built by hands that had once trembled but now only held. Sophie often reflected on where she'd started, from cold sidewalks and desperation to a rooftop view of the city that once devoured her, now hers to claim. She knew there would be hard days again. But now, she faced them hand in hand with Ethan, surrounded by love and a legacy of strength she could pass on. Somewhere in the midst of all this, a truth had settled into her bones: the past might shape you, but it doesn't get to define you. Not if you choose to begin again. And she had. They all had. Together. Sophie Lane's story begins in a place so low that even hope struggled to find breath. A young woman with 2 children clutched tightly to her sides, shivering not just from the cold but from the ache of defeat, of abandonment, and the invisible weight of dreams that never came true. The sidewalk she sat on in San Francisco was not just concrete, it was the last rung of a ladder she thought she had fallen from forever. That day, when Ethan Callahan walked past her on that crowded street, could have been like any other. Another set of eyes avoiding hers. Another man in a tailored suit pretending not to notice. But Ethan didn't pretend. He stopped. He saw her. And, more importantly, he remembered. What followed was not a miracle in the fairy tale sense. There were no instant transformations, no magic wands. Instead, it was the beginning of a quiet, steady revolution, a reclamation of dignity, of family, of possibility. Sophie didn't trust easily. Life had taught her better. She had known comfort once but had been punished for believing it would last. Yet here was Ethan, a man who owed her nothing, offering a key not just to his home, but to a new beginning. And he did so without condition. In the safety of Ethan's penthouse, Sophie and her daughters, Ava and Lily, began to thaw. Slowly. The warmth wasn't just in the literal fire that lit their evenings, but in the consistency of breakfast together, in the toys left on the floor that no longer needed to be packed up every night for fear of being stolen. It was in Ethan learning how to braid hair, in Ava drawing family portraits that always included him. But healing is never linear. Sophie had to face the ghosts of her past, none more haunting than Nathan, the man who had fathered her children but fled at the first sight of responsibility. His return tested every wall she'd built, every step she'd taken toward trusting again. Ethan stood beside her through it all, never trying to rescue, only support. Nathan's repeated failures only sharpened the contrast between biological connection and true fatherhood. And then there was growth. Education. Sophie, once a dropout resigned to survival, walked into classrooms again. Not to escape her reality, but to shape it. She studied, she earned her degree, she began contributing to society with the very heart and strength that had once been overlooked. Her journey wasn't just about getting off the street. It was about finding her voice, and using it to build something lasting. Ethan, too, transformed. He had been a man of silence and solitude, haunted by a life of structured ambition. But Sophie and the girls cracked that armor. Through their presence, he rediscovered laughter, unpredictability, and the rich, messy magic of love. The penthouse, once a monument to isolation, became a home. When Ethan proposed, it wasn't just about romance. It was a moment that sealed the idea that Sophie was no longer defined by her past. She was being seen, wholly, not as someone in need but as someone of value. Their wedding was less about spectacle and more about truth, two people who had been broken in different ways choosing to heal together. The arrival of their son, named Hope, was not just the birth of a new child. It was the birth of a future Sophie never dared to dream. A future where love wasn't earned through suffering, but given freely. Where children grew up knowing stability, and a woman once discarded by society stood tall as a mother, a wife, and a woman of strength. What can we take from Sophie's journey? That rock bottom is not the end. That the human spirit is not a fragile thing, but a fierce one. That we are never truly too far gone to begin again. Her story teaches us that healing requires patience, that trust is earned through presence, not promises, and that love, real, lasting love, is built through showing up, day after day, even when it's hard. We often talk about success as money, power, or prestige. But true wealth lies in connection. In finding people who see us at our lowest and believe in who we can become. Sophie and Ethan's story is proof that compassion can change the trajectory of a life. That the small, quiet decision to stop and see someone, to really see them, can set off a ripple of transformation that touches generations. So how do we live this lesson? We look around. We pay attention. We offer help not with pity, but with respect. We choose to believe that everyone we pass has a story, and that with the right support, anyone can write a new ending. We stop measuring people by where they are, and start asking who they could become with just one chance. We also reflect inward. Maybe you see yourself in Sophie, holding on by a thread. Or maybe you see yourself in Ethan, longing to give but not knowing how. Wherever you are, this story is a reminder that your next chapter doesn't have to look like your last. That beginnings often come disguised as endings. And that, with love and courage, redemption isn't just possible. It's inevitable. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of compassion, of resilience, of second chances, then please, support our channel. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and share this with someone who might need it today. Your support helps us continue telling stories that matter. Stories that heal. Stories that remind us that even in our darkest moments, we are never alone. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person stopping on the street to change everything. Thank you for being here. And stay tuned for the next incredible journey. It's coming soon.